Hello, and welcome to this discussion about Jane Eyre and how or if she decides to rebel against injustice in her life. In this section of the novel, leaving Gateshead Hall was an event that Jane Eyre looked forward to with excitement. Because of the interview between Mrs. Reed and Mr. Brocklehurst, the boarding school owner, there was trepidation about how she would be received. Her reputation was already seriously in jeopardy at the new place, along with the possible continuation of abuse. Leaving abusive relationships behind was the reason for getting out of the home. She deliberately confronted Mrs. Reed and particularly the son John in an attempt to find some kind of respect. She questioned what she had done wrong to be left out of family gatherings, attacked John when he had physically hit her with a book, and challenged Mrs. Reed's version of her in front of the boarding school owner as a liar. It had backfired and made things worse. The only hope was going to the boarding school. She remained defiant to the very last when Mrs. Reed visited her room the night before leaving. Mrs. Reed asked her not to wake her or her children when leaving in the morning, and yet, at the same time, that Jane would remember her as a friend and have kind words. This dismissive command, indicating she didn't care that Jane was leaving while demanding a good gesture, was yet another disgrace. In the last bit of rebellion left, Jane quietly covered herself completely under the bedding, turned her back to Mrs. Reed, and said nothing. When she gets to Lowood Institution boarding school, a whole new way of rebellion would be taught among the more mundane lessons. What she found at Lowood was abysmal, although not as personally terrible like Gateshead Hall. All the girls, including the teachers, were in the poorest of conditions. The clothing was roughly made, some with patchwork, the regiment of learning and living causing constant fatigue, and the food sparse enough that it was a wonder none died of starvation. Jane Eyre was confused by how it was called an institution, and yet presented itself more as a church. She read the Bible passage from St. Matthew 16, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father," above the entranceway. She couldn't reconcile the administrative approach to taking care of children versus treating them with Christian charity. An institution is cold and calculating, while charity is warm and thoughtful. The owner of the institution, Mr. Brocklehurst, was no more a Christian to Jane than the boarding house a place of good works. He was obsessed with outer appearances, making sure none of the girls' hair and clothing was at all more than average or dreary. Any curls or fashionable clothing of even minimal stylishness was flattened and taken off. Even worse, when the morning gruel was burnt to an unappetizing condition, he scolded the teachers for later giving a scant amount of bread and butter to appease the natural appetite. His excuse was that Christ and the martyrs suffered, and so the children could learn self-control by doing the same. All this while his own family ate and dressed in visible decadence. The children and some of the staff rebelled against this, but in minor ways. Sensitive to hypocrisy, Jane Eyre vowed that she would openly confront whatever injustice was presented for her to face. If called up to censor over behavior that had no real evil behind it, she would lash out and demand recompense. It would have been a bold move meant to overturn the establishment, but it wouldn't have been very smart. She was warned that doing something as direct and fierce as her stated intentions wouldn't change the institution. All that it would do is bring wrath on her head. With the end result, she would be expelled. There was nowhere else for her to go. She would, at a tender age, be sent out into the cold world all alone, with no money and food, having only the clothes she was wearing. It was the same condition as what she found rebelling at the old Gateshead Hall home. No doubt she would have very soon died, and no one care. Against her words that she would stand up to injustice, she did nothing but listen with fear when she was called a liar by Mr. Brocklehurst in front of the whole school. She was told to stand for a half hour on an elevated stool, and did just that. It might have been that her spirit was broken, but more than likely she learned from observation new ways to go against the system. She had to know when to pick the battles and how far to go in thwarting harmful rules. The first lessons on the various ways to rebel were from the teachers themselves. For the most part, all of them were severe in chiding simple mistakes and personal rule breaking. They did, however, participate in showing some charity of their own. As was mentioned, the teachers could have allowed the children to starve when they didn't eat the porridge. Instead, they gave morsels of bread and water a little later on to help sustain them. They explained to Mr. Brocklehurst they did it to save the children from starvation so they could concentrate on school. No doubt this was true, and what they did necessary instead of letting them go hungry. Yet, it seems this was not the first time such an occurrence happened, and despite known rules and regimentation, they went ahead with protecting the children from dangerous cruelty. On another occasion, there were a few girls who were given clean tuckers, or underclothing, in the same week. The rules demanded only one clean pair a week, probably making for a lot of uncomfortable girls. Scolded for even this decency, they excused it because they visited who can only be guessed were money patrons to the institution. Mr. Brocklehurst accepted this, but demanded, like the extra food, that it never happen again. Kindness against cruelty became rebellion against ruthless authoritarianism. The students also did their own rebelling against the system, but within the rules guiding them. They listened to the teachers, did what they were told, and generally followed the daily regiments. When things became intolerable, they didn't eat bad food or seek ways to wash up when the cleaning water became ice. When given free time, the students became loud and used it to their advantage. It took a little work to calm them back down. They might have, on occasion, not listened to or memorized daily lessons. Worst of all was the older children stealing the bread of the younger ones to survive, leaving the younger often ending up going hungry. Finding ways to go against the rules was a delicate balance between defiantly simple bad behavior and outright rebellion. The students in Lowood Institution didn't learn love, humility, and charity as supposedly the purpose behind the institution's methods. Instead, they most likely learned how to go behind authorities' backs, treat others poorly to survive, and to impress people with outside appearances. There was one girl, Helen Burns, who took a different approach to rebelling against the unjust treatments. She let herself be punished and scolded. When she was told that she was careless and not organized properly, she agreed. When she was told to stand in a corner because of lesson mistakes, she did just that. During a time when she was supposed to be working in the garden, instead Jane Eyre found her reading a book. That might seem her most subversive act, but the book, Rasselas, by Samuel Johnson, was itself a moralistic tale. It taught the creed that Burns lived by and curiously used against the institution, that human life does not bring happiness, and therefore happiness must not be expected. In this way, no punishment, harassment, bad fortune, or lack of want will destroy individuality. Burns decides how to act rather than be at the whim of reacting. Although it allows those in authority to continue the distasteful treatment and injustices, she will not be broken into fearful submission. Her inner thoughts and beliefs will not bend. These two kinds of rebellion have both been used in history against cruelty. The most famous of non-violent and submissive protesting is Gandhi in India. He and his followers had hunger strikes, sit-ins, and a quiet revolution against English occupation. They accepted the mistreatment and attacks by the English forces while not giving in to demands to surrender. Eventually, India gained independence. But this method doesn't always work. Chinese students gathered in Tiananmen Square to protest the Chinese dictatorship and request more freedoms, with Lady Liberty as their symbol. It was crushed by a ruthless military who killed many young demonstrators. About a generation before Charlotte Bronte, the United States gained its independence by fighting England in a bloody war, although not the first or the last to do so in history. Contrary, the French Revolution brought down its government by bloody deeds, but the cure was just as terrible as the social depravity it sought to remedy. The old elite was replaced by Napoleon, a warmongering tyrant. Faced with the choice between open rebellion and non-violent protest, Jane Eyre sided with Helen Burns. The circumstances of Lowood were a huge physical burden, but she found friends among both teachers and students, treating those who are enemies, no matter how loathsome, with love and respect opened possibilities that might otherwise be closed. She had all the food, clothing, books, and money she would want at Gateshead, but absolutely no love. Here at Lowood, she had nothing, but she did have love. She learned from Burns' example the lessons of humility and perseverance when all the lecturing and punishments from Mrs. Reed and Mr. Brocklehurst could not. She could have discipline and self-control, even if the practice of it was in its infancy. Click the subscribe button and notification bell to not miss the next installments and analysis.